Who am I? Oh, you want me to get going? Well, my name is Maurice Podbrey. I came to Montreal in 1966, invited here to come and teach at the National Theatre School, and it was 3 glorious years during the World Fair, etc., etc. And then I sort of fell in love with the city and wanted to stay here, but there was no work for an English-speaking actor at that time. And so, under various provocations, including my wife, I thought I'd try and start a theatre company. There was a lot of government largesse at that point, and this sort of committee support of marvelous people and volunteer help and so on. At that time I was living in Old Montreal on the Rue de l'Hôpital, because the National Theatre School where I was working was at the bottom of the Main. The old Salada Tea building, if anybody remembers that anymore. So I lived in Old Montreal and would make the short walk across to the Main. And passed by this incredible edifice that was the old Stock Exchange. And while doing that, I heard that Jacques Langueron had attempted to start a theatre company. Well, more than a theatre company, he wanted to open it on a grand scale with a club, a restaurant, 2 theatres, and he was trying to play a rather tricky political game, playing Quebec off against Ottawa, thinking they would both race to fund him. But neither came to play the game, and so he fell between 2 stools. But he had shown me round the building, and I'd seen what he had done. They'd adapted the small space into something of a performance area, and the bigger space was just had been stripped down. We were able to inherit what they had already done. But it was tricky getting it because they'd created quite a few obstacles in there. The church lands, which are just behind the theatre, they'd been somewhat alienated by these actresses sporting themselves on the veranda, as the priests were trying to do their reflective walkings around the grounds, a bit distracting. So, but we had to get their permission to get egress from the building onto their grounds in case there was an emergency. So that took a bit of doing, and the funding took a bit of doing. But as I say, it was a very good time in Canadian theatre history, and things fell into place remarkably quickly, remarkable. So within months, literally, we got it open, and then after 5 years, we managed to buy the building and adapt it. Ended up running it for 28 years. In 1997, I then stepped down from it. So I'm indebted to Jacques Langueron. He told me once, actually, that after a couple of years, there had been an attempt by the Quebec government to repossess the building and give it to him as a French theatre, realizing that we had fought to build it up and open it and develop it and so on. He declined that offer, and I think that was very honorable of him. Yeah. No theatre, no English theatre had been presented here for previous decade at least. So there was a great wave of new theatre which nobody had seen. And so I was able to draw on that. There were some touring shows which came up from the States, usually the third rung musicals, third incarnation of Broadway musicals. People spoke nostalgically about things that had happened about a decade previously, but I was never party to that. So I literally stepped into a vacuum here. I could do anything that would be new. My great interest would be in developing new writers, because I think it's in presenting new work that you really identify the theatre most clearly. But that took 4 or 5 years before I was able to develop the writers and so on. So for 5 years, we just really brought in plays from other places, with a couple of exceptions. One of the exceptions was the Great White Computer, which was a play about the kerfuffle at Sir George Williams when the students took over the building and emptied the computer cards from the top floor, which And there was a court case, and that was a big event in Montreal, and we dramatized that in the first year. That was something. It was interesting because being the main English theatre at that point in the city, we were looked at to see what was the weather vane, how did we respond to this, what role would we play. And I struggled to find a role for myself in that situation, historical situation. But we tried to position ourselves so that we could make a constructive contribution to the transition that was going on. We wanted to be a home for the Anglophone community, but not a ultra-conservative home. We wanted to be a progressive place where the change would be recognized and welcomed as it was necessary to do, but at the same time to earn the respect of the Quebec Francophone community for who we were and what we could contribute to the overall scene. And that was the balance that we were trying to achieve. And that was difficult because you never knew what product you had in hand to achieve that. And it was marvelous that we were able to find new writers and comedians like Barjan Blue and Fenario and Rossi and other writers who could offer that response and earn the respect of the majority population of this province. That was the route that we tried to find for ourselves. And I think in some measure we were successful. Of course, we could also have been better in what we tried to do, but I think we achieved some of that, yeah.